On a wet March night in 1987, in a quiet Portland apartment building on Willow Street, a life simply stopped. 29-year-old interior design assistant Michelle Baylor came home from work like she always did. A neighbor saw her carry grocery bags up to apartment 3B. A few hours later, her TV was still on. A pot of water sat half evaporated on the stove. Her coat hung neatly by the door. And Michelle was gone. The door was locked from the outside. Her wallet was on the counter. Her bed was untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no note, no late-night phone call. Police quickly focused on three people: the angry neighbor with a history of threats, the obsessive ex-boyfriend with a stalking charge, and the jealous coworker who stood to lose a promotion to Michelle. On paper, they all looked like perfect suspects. But as the years passed, one truth refused to fit the file. None of them could be proven to have been inside 3B that night. So who walked through that locked door? Stay with me as we reopen the silent apartment on Willow Street. And before we get deeper into this case, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments who you think is responsible for Michelle's disappearance. Portland, Oregon, in the spring of 1987, was a place people described as calm, organized, and predictable. The city was growing, but the neighborhoods on the outer edge still felt quiet, especially around Willow Street, where families left their windows open at night and parents let their children walk to school without checking the clock. The few crimes that reached the local newspaper were usually small disputes or petty theft, nothing that made people change their routines or look over their shoulders. Willow Street Apartments sat near the end of the block, a simple three-story building with light brown panels, a narrow shared entrance, and a small sign that had faded over the years. Residents were mostly long-term tenants, people who recognized each other on the stairs and remembered birthdays without needing reminders. Nothing about the place suggested danger or secrecy. It was the type of building where missing a neighbor was more surprising than seeing one. The apartment complex was built in the mid-1970s. It didn't include any modern surveillance features. The hallway lights flickered when the power dipped during cold nights, and the security relied mainly on shared keys and a coded door. No cameras, no lobby guard, and no recorded entry logs. At the time, no one questioned it. People trusted the building and trusted each other. Even years later, former tenants would describe it the same way: simple, quiet, and ordinary. Michelle Baylor, 29, lived alone on the third floor in apartment 3B. She moved in around May of 1986, almost a full year before the date that would later be circled in every case file. She worked full-time as an assistant interior designer at Portland Homestyle and Company, a company located about a 20-minute drive from the apartment. Her schedule was steady: Monday through Friday, 8:30 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. Her coworkers remembered her as someone who focused on work and didn't chase attention. One of them later said, "She wasn't rude or distant. She just didn't seem like she needed anyone outside of her job." Another described her as the person who always met deadlines but never stayed for drinks. She never caused problems, never shared dramatic stories, and never changed her habits without a clear reason. She didn't talk about her personal life much, but no one at work felt she was hiding anything. To them, she was a responsible employee who showed up, finished tasks, and left on time. The most notable comment made about her routine was that she always used the same blue planner, marked with thin red ink, and closed each workday with her desk clean. Her private life matched her professional stability. She had no criminal record, no known mental health treatment, and no reported behavioral issues. Her financial records later confirmed that she paid rent on time, had no large outstanding debts, and had not applied for any sudden loans. No evidence suggested that she was planning to relocate or leave her job. She had ended a relationship about a year before with a man named Joseph Joey Marvin, who lived in the same city. Their breakup had not led to public arguments, and there were no reports of restraining orders or police involvement. She did not date publicly afterward, and no one from her workplace recalled her mentioning a new partner.
Her family lived in Ohio, several states away, and phone calls were the primary way she stayed connected. They spoke roughly once a month, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on her schedule. Although the calls were described as respectful and consistent, she rarely shared details of her day-to-day life, and her family did not express concern about her living alone. They trusted her independence and understood that she preferred space and routine. She kept her household simple: no pets, no roommates, and no regular visitors besides occasional professional or delivery contacts. She bought only what she needed, mostly groceries and small home items that matched her job interests. Neighbors noticed that she didn't entertain guests late at night and didn't bring home loud friends or parties. Her apartment remained quiet in a building where even normal footsteps could echo. She wasn't unpopular, only private. The kind of person someone might forget to think about until the moment she didn't show up. One detail that later caught investigators' attention appeared inside her apartment, on a standard hanging wall calendar. The date, March 14, 1987, was circled in red ink. But she had written no explanation, no notes, and no abbreviation. There was no appointment listed at work for that day, no travel plans, and no family-related events matched the timing. It was not payday, rent day, or any holiday. No one at her workplace remembered her mentioning plans for that date. The red mark remained unexplained, but it immediately became part of the investigation timeline. Although her lifestyle seemed uneventful, the lack of daily interaction increased risk without anyone recognizing it. Living alone meant that no one checked in automatically. Not having a roommate meant that silence was normal. Not having pets meant there was no reason for neighbors to notice unusual sounds or behavior. She was present, yet her world was small enough that her absence could go unnoticed longer than most. People later said that Michelle fit the kind of tenant who blended into the background. She didn't create gossip, didn't complain, and didn't change routines often enough to alarm anyone. A woman on the second floor who occasionally passed her in the lobby recalled a brief memory that stayed with her. She always smiled politely, but you could tell she was on her way somewhere else in her mind. Another neighbor mentioned that she walked quietly, never slammed doors, and never caused disputes, not even over parking spaces, which were normally a common source of tension in apartment buildings. Even though everything about her life aligned with stability, that very stability made what happened later more jarring. There were no public warnings, no arguments heard through walls, no sudden work complaints, and no frantic calls to family. Everything about her background appeared normal, controlled, and safe. But the calmness surrounding her life would soon raise a difficult question. How can someone with such a steady footprint suddenly fall out of view without anyone witnessing the moment? As the clock moved toward the date marked in red, There was nothing in her environment that hinted at danger. Willow Street continued its quiet rhythm. People carried groceries, collected mail, returned from their shifts, and locked their doors as usual. Apartment 3B looked no different from any other home in the building. Nothing outside suggested that anything was about to change. But when the events tied to that marked date finally unfolded, the neighborhood's idea of safety would never feel the same again. On March 14, 1987, at around 5:02 in the afternoon, Michelle was recorded leaving her workplace, Portland Homestyle and Company. The timestamp came from the company time clock, and two coworkers remembered seeing her pass through the glass door. She didn't seem rushed, confused, or upset. Her walk was steady, and she held her bag close to her side the same way she did every day. When one of her colleagues invited her to join a small dinner gathering, she replied quietly, "Maybe another time," before heading toward the parking lot. No one pressed her for details because she never explained her after-work plans, and it wasn't unusual for her to decline social invitations. Traffic in the late afternoon was moderate, and the distance between her workplace and Willow Street apartments was short enough that she would have arrived on schedule without anyone noticing a delay. Nothing on the road, at nearby stores, or around the complex later indicated any sign of interruption. No witnesses from the surrounding area reported seeing her speaking to anyone, stopping along the street, or showing distress in public view. At approximately 5:40 p.m., a first-floor resident saw her walking into the building carrying a brown grocery bag. The witness later described it as a simple observation, not an unusual moment, and not alarming in any way. She was alone. No one followed her, and there were no unfamiliar vehicles parked outside the entrance. The resident said, "She looked exactly the same as every day, like she was just heading home to settle in for the night." That was the last confirmed sighting of Michelle while she was known to be alive and inside her residential building. From that point, all remaining details came from physical evidence, timeline reconstruction, and environmental sound reports from neighbors. Between approximately 7 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., the television inside apartment 3B was on at a normal volume. Multiple neighbors heard it, but nothing about the sound raised suspicion. The walls and ceilings inside Willow Street apartments were thin enough that arguments, falling objects, slamming doors, and even phone conversations could usually be heard. On this night, there were no interruptions, no panic sounds, no unusual activity, and no clear indication that anyone was struggling or calling for help. In the kitchen, a pot of water was left on the stove at a low setting. It had already cooled by the time investigators entered days later, but residue inside the pot showed that it had been heated, as if Michelle intended to make tea, soup, or a simple meal. The stove was turned off, but someone had clearly started preparing something, suggesting she had not planned to leave the apartment again. This detail became significant later because it supported the idea that her evening was meant to be quiet, predictable, and uneventful, just like most nights before. Phone logs from Portland Telecom confirmed that there were no incoming or outgoing calls from her apartment line after 6 p.m. That information helped narrow down the period in which her communication stopped. Since personal cell phones were uncommon in 1987, the absence of landline activity was an important marker. It signaled that she did not contact anyone, ask for help, confirm plans, or report a disturbance. Investigators would later conclude that if anything happened inside apartment 3B, it happened without a chance for her to use the phone. The access log kept by the building manager reported no recorded visitors or delivery services on the night of March 14th. Only residents and the assigned mail carrier had legitimate access, and the building's locked entry meant that strangers would need to be let in. Because there were no cameras in the building or surrounding street corners in 1987, there was no visual cross-reference available for law enforcement. Neighbors also confirmed that they did not hear unusual footsteps in the third-floor hallway that night. Under normal circumstances, even late-night movement was noticeable because of the building's structure. One third-floor resident said, "It sounded like any other night. Nothing slammed, nothing shook. I never heard her door open again after she came home." There were no reports of a door being shut aggressively, someone running down the stairs, or an object falling. The silence itself became one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence. The following morning, the apartment door was found locked from the outside, which investigators described as one of the most disturbing timeline details. Michelle lived alone and no one had seen her leave. If she had walked out on her own, there was no explanation for her leaving the television on or abandoning a heated pot. There was also no explanation for why no one saw her exit, especially since the staircase and hallway were visible to multiple units facing each other. Around 5:30 a.m. on March 15th, the neighborhood newspaper carrier walked past the building and noticed that the light from the television in apartment 3B was still visible through the curtains. When asked later, he recalled that it struck him as unusual only because it seemed too early for someone to be awake, yet too late for someone to still be up. He said, "It crossed my mind for a second, but people have strange schedules, so I didn't think it meant anything." No residents on any floor reported seeing Michelle walk out of the main entrance, use the parking lot, or leave with belongings. She did not own a pet that required walking, which removed another natural opportunity for neighbors to notice a routine break. Without surveillance cameras, law enforcement could not confirm whether she left voluntarily, with someone, or was removed from the building without detection. By the end of the documented timeline, investigators referred to this period as a silent disappearance window. It took place inside a familiar home, surrounded by neighbors, without noise, witness alarm, or any immediate sign of forced exit. Everything seemed ordinary, until someone tried to contact her and realized she had not answered a phone, returned a call, or shown up for work. The timeline held no visible struggle, no confirmed confrontation, and no obvious sign that she expected anything unusual to occur. A simple evening inside apartment 3B became the last verifiable chapter of her known movements. And every investigative question that followed pointed back to those final, quiet hours, when she was seen entering the building and never seen coming back out. 2 full workdays passed without Michelle showing up at Portland Homestyle and Company. She never missed work without a message, not even for illness or personal errands, and she always informed the office if she needed to arrive late or leave early. When she failed to appear on the morning of March 16th, and then again on March 17th, the Human Resources desk called her apartment landline several times. The phone rang for a long duration each time, but no one answered. And there was no call return later that afternoon. Her coworkers became increasingly unsettled because Michelle was known for consistency, silence, and punctuality, not sudden breaks in communication. One team member later said, "She could be private or distant at times, but she was never irresponsible. Something was off from the moment she didn't walk in." After internal attempts continued without any response, 2 colleagues drove by her apartment building during lunch hour on March 17th, hoping to see movement through the hallway or parking area. They did not see her car being moved, and they could not identify any sign that she had left the residence early that morning. They rang the main entrance bell but received no response. The building manager was not immediately available, and the company staff returned to work without answers, still assuming she might call once she saw the missed calls. By 3:10 p.m. that same day, the office filed a formal missing person report with the Portland Police Bureau, citing unusual silence, absence without notice, and the inability to reach any emergency contacts. Law enforcement accepted the report due to the unexplained pattern, and a pair of responding officers visited Willow Street apartments shortly after. The building manager was contacted again and arrived with the key to the main entrance and the floor access hallway. When the front door to apartment 3B was reached, officers noted that the door was locked from the outside using the cylinder lock, not the internal chain or latch. There were no scratch marks near the keyhole, and no pry damage visible on the frame, knob, hinges, or strike plate. The television inside her unit was audible through the door, playing continuously. There were no voices, no movement sounds, and no response when they knocked and announced. Under probable concern of welfare, the building manager unlocked the door and police entered to conduct a safety and presence check. The television in the living area was still on at normal volume. A light jacket belonging to Michelle was hanging neatly on a hook near the door, and her identification wallet was placed on the kitchen counter alongside everyday personal items. Officers later documented that nothing about the entry area looked hurried. There were no bags packed, no items scattered, and no visible sign that she intended to leave the apartment in the middle of any task. The kitchen presented one of the first physical indicators that something had interrupted her evening. A pot was left on the stovetop with caked water residue inside. The burner switch was off at the time of entry, but the metal surface retained mild warmth, suggesting it had been used not long before the television was left running. This small detail led officers to believe she was in the middle of preparing something, or was planning to settle into a standard routine, rather than leaving for a social visit or overnight stay. Officers then examined the apartment for signs of departure preparation. No luggage, duffel bags, storage tubs, or missing seasonal clothing were found. Drawers and closets appeared full and properly arranged. A purse remained on the counter with cards and cash inside. This observation further lowered the likelihood of voluntary departure, especially without contacting her workplace or family. Her shoes, outerwear, and daily essentials were all still in place.
Next, officers inspected windows and balcony door locks. Every locking mechanism showed a secure position, with no tool damage and no loose fittings. The third-floor balcony had dust residue consistent with long-term inactivity. There was no reason to believe she exited through any route other than the front door, yet no one witnessed her leaving, and the hallway remained silent on the night she was last heard inside the unit. The bedroom offered more confirmation that the night had not played out as a normal routine. The bed was neatly made, pillows stacked in a standard arrangement, and no indentation patterns suggested overnight use. There were no alarm clocks indicating a set time for early departure. The small vanity showed no missing items such as toothbrush, hairbrush, makeup, or small wallet-sized essentials that people tend to carry even during short, unplanned outings. In the living area, a hanging calendar displayed a bold red ink circle around the date March 14th, but no writing, note, name, appointment, or location was attached to it. The absence of explanation made it unclear whether this was a routine reminder, a personal message, or an unshared significant event. It became one of the few physical clues related to timing inside the apartment. After documenting the scene, police recorded the case under the reference code PPB-M87-14B and classified it as missing suspicious circumstances. This classification was based not on visible injury or evidence of forced entry, but on the lack of voluntary departure indicators, the abrupt halt of communication, and the environment suggesting an interrupted home routine. Officers did not release any immediate conclusions at that time. They focused on establishing the last confirmed actions, reviewing apartment conditions, and confirming that her personal belongings showed no sign of travel, relocation, or emotional withdrawal. When neighbors were later approached, many expressed disbelief at the situation. A resident from the third floor remarked, "Everything looked normal that night. If something happened, it happened without anyone hearing." The lack of recorded noise carried strong weight, because the building structure normally amplified even small disturbances. By the end of the initial response, investigators described the apartment as a still frame that did not match the expectation of a casual departure. The television was on, the kitchen task was incomplete, essential items were untouched, and the door was locked from the outside. The unanswered calls, the silent living space, and the unexplained timing mark on the calendar together formed the first official foundation of the case. From that moment forward, every investigative step focused not on assumptions or personal interpretation, but on establishing how a routine evening inside a familiar apartment stopped without warning and without a single confirmed witness to the moment it ended. The investigation entered its wider phase once the initial scene was documented and classified. Detectives began with the residents closest to apartment 3B, focusing on those within hearing range. They moved from door to door across the entire third floor and into the floors above and below, asking the same set of questions. Whether anyone heard an argument, footsteps, furniture movement, or unusual voices on the night of March 14th. The responses were almost identical, and the lack of variation made investigators pay closer attention. Residents described the evening as calm, consistent with routine, and without pauses in background noise, except for the sound of Michelle's television. The closest witness, Mrs. Summers from Unit 3C, said, "Everything sounded normal that night. Her TV was on, but that was it. I didn't hear her talking to anyone." With no confirmed sound of a second person inside, detectives categorized the night as quiet enough that any disruptive event should have created some audible sign. Attention then shifted to apartment access. The building manager explained that only 3 keys existed for the unit, one assigned to Michelle, one stored with management in a locked office, and one held by the maintenance department. There was no record of extra copies, no recent lock replacements, and no sign that the door had been tampered with. That detail gave investigators a narrow entry list. Anyone inside the apartment between the time she was last seen and the moment the door was found locked from the outside would need either a key, undisrupted access, or a convincing method of entry that left no visible trace. Detectives took statements from the maintenance team, the management office staff, and any worker with historical access privileges. None reported recent entry into apartment 3B.
Information from her workplace soon became part of the investigative checklist. The company confirmed that Michelle was scheduled to be reviewed for a senior assistant promotion in May of 1987. There were no written warnings, disciplinary notes, or project complaints recorded in her personnel file. When asked whether Michelle seemed under stress or dissatisfied with her job, one colleague responded, "She was quiet, but she wasn't someone trying to get away from anything here." The absence of work-related conflict reduced the probability of sudden flight or intentional withdrawal. Detectives then conducted internal interviews at the workplace to search for interpersonal issues that might have escalated. No staff member reported hostility or feud, and the company did not identify any coworker with a known disagreement strong enough to raise suspicion. Employees consistently described Michelle as following procedures, handing off work clearly, and avoiding arguments. She didn't socialize much, but she didn't create professional enemies. Back at the apartment building, investigators constructed a list of individuals with routine access to the property. The list included long-term residents, frequent visitors, the cleaning and repair team, management office employees, and the assigned postal worker. Neighbors who occasionally received deliveries or maintenance requests confirmed that outside access required someone already inside to open the locked door. Because the building had no concierge, guard, or sign-in system, detectives needed personal recollection instead of recorded entry logs. They recognized immediately that the lack of building surveillance made it impossible to verify movement patterns or late-night travel through the hallways. A key limitation of the investigation was the absence of cameras in the hallways, entry area, or parking lot. The building management explained that Willow Street apartments had been built more than a decade earlier and had never installed security systems because residents valued low-cost housing over modernization. Detectives marked this as a major evidentiary barrier. Without footage or electronic entry data, it proved difficult to confirm whether anyone had approached or left apartment 3B unnoticed, especially during quiet hours. Investigators expanded their interviews to friends from earlier years, old classmates, and casual acquaintances to determine whether Michelle had mentioned anything unusual, planned travels, or sudden interpersonal concerns. No one was able to point to a recent emotional shift, suspicious individual, or confidential meeting. The people she spoke to most frequently were coworkers, not neighbors, and even they maintained that her life appeared stable in the days leading up to March 14th. Detectives also confirmed that she did not attend clubs, social events, or recurring gatherings that could have drawn external risk. Financial review became the next part of the timeline analysis. Her bank account was examined over the 10 days prior to her disappearance. Investigators found only routine transactions associated with groceries, utilities, and standard living expenses. There were no unexplained deposits or withdrawals, no attempts to close accounts, and no purchases associated with travel, relocation, or emergency preparation. Nothing in her financial record suggested voluntary disappearance or fear-based preparation. Detectives then requested ATM surveillance reports and machine activity logs from nearby banking locations, even though ATM cameras were not universal at the time. After checking available timestamps, none showed transactions tied to Michelle or her card numbers after the evening of March 14th. This result firmly supported the theory that she did not leave the building to access money, nor did anyone else use her information. During broader interviews with people connected to the building, the local post office verified the identity of the regular mail carrier assigned to Willow Street apartments.
His name was Harvey Quinn, age 54, with many years of continuous service in that neighborhood. He was well known among the residents and routinely delivered mail directly into locked unit mailboxes. Some residents mentioned that he remembered family names, birthdays, and schedules because he had been on the same route for so long. One resident commented, "He knows everyone here and treats us like old neighbors." Detectives added his name to the list of individuals with day-to-day building familiarity, since routine mail delivery provided consistent observation privileges.
By the end of this interview and data collection phase, investigators reached an early conclusion regarding behavioral probability. The available evidence did not support a voluntary disappearance scenario. Everything found inside the apartment suggested an interrupted night rather than planned departure. The building access records narrowed potential involvement to someone with knowledge, familiarity, and the ability to move through the property without drawing attention. Although no clear suspect was declared at this stage, investigators agreed that the next steps required focusing on individuals with quiet access, long-term exposure to resident routines, and the ability to blend into the building without raising alarm. That direction was not based on speculation, but on the collective outcome of witness statements, access limitations, environment familiarity, and the absence of digital surveillance in 1987. The investigation eventually narrowed its attention to 3 individuals who, based on records, testimony, and proximity, presented reasonable grounds for questioning. None of them appeared outwardly connected to one another, but each had at least one known factor that aligned with possible motive. Detectives approached this stage by reviewing criminal history, relationship context, workplace tension, and behavioral patterns surrounding the days before and after March 14th. Even though no single person immediately stood out with clear evidence, the investigative team documented every anomaly, inconsistency, and traceable opportunity. The first subject examined was 34-year-old Jackson Reeve, a resident living on the same floor as Michelle. His apartment was close enough that he would have been capable of hearing regular movement patterns from Unit 3B, including when lights were turned on, when doors opened, and when television volume changed. Police reports showed that Jackson had been involved in several public disturbances inside the building between 1985 and 1986, largely involving alcohol, shouting, and aggressive behavior. Building records documented complaints from neighbors who described him as unpredictable and confrontational when intoxicated. A woman from another floor once claimed that Jackson threatened her verbally, but she did not file a formal complaint because she feared ongoing confrontation. As a result, the case never progressed beyond informal documentation. Several residents told detectives they had heard Jackson striking the wall or yelling late at night, within a few weeks of Michelle's disappearance. One tenant said, "He wasn't violent toward everyone, but when things set him off, he seemed like he could snap fast." Investigators noted that his proximity, history of instability, and lack of verifiable alibi created concern. But none of those points alone could establish a direct connection. The second individual on the list was Michelle's former partner, 32-year-old Joseph "Joey" Marvin. His past contained an incident from 1983 involving allegations of stalking a previous girlfriend. That event resulted in a temporary police intervention, though it did not lead to formal sentencing. According to his interview, Joey still cared about Michelle
and had once hoped for reconciliation after their breakup. He insisted that they had not met or spoken in person for several months, but phone records revealed a call placed from his number to Michelle's apartment 2 days before she was last seen. That call was never answered, and the reason it was made remained unclear. When asked, Joey stated that he just wanted to check on her and denied any intention beyond that. Detectives searched for verification through third-party witnesses, but found no one who could confirm personal contact between the two during that period. While his past behavior placed him in a category of potential relational risk, there was no documented evidence of direct confrontation, entry to the apartment, or recent dispute. The third individual reviewed was 29-year-old Debbie Nolan, Michelle's closest coworker within the office, but also someone who had recently been tied to silent career tension. At Portland Homestyle & Company, both Debbie and Michelle were considered strong candidates for project advancement. Some employees said that the two women remained polite but noticeably distant during the weeks leading up to March, especially when major assignments were being distributed. One employee commented, "They were friendly, but you could sense something had changed. They were both trying to prove themselves." There were no records of confrontation, written complaints, or disciplinary reports between them. Debbie denied visiting or attempting to visit Willow Street apartments and claimed that their connection existed strictly within workplace boundaries. No neighbor, resident, or passerby reported seeing Debbie near the building around the time Michelle vanished. Without physical presence or suspicious communication, her potential motive relied solely on competitive workplace positioning, making it weaker than relational or behavioral histories seen in the other two subjects. Once detectives completed their initial review, they compared the three profiles against core investigative pillars: motive, opportunity, and physical or forensic connection. Each person met motive to varying degrees. Jackson presented a behavioral red flag rooted in aggression and impulse. Joey represented unresolved emotional ties and past obsessive behavior. Debbie embodied professional rivalry concealed beneath polite workplace interaction. Yet, none of them demonstrated strong opportunity evidence. Investigators determined that opportunity required either confirmed access or confirmed proximity to the interior of the apartment, particularly between the early evening of March 14th and the morning of March 15th. None of the three individuals were seen entering or exiting the building during that timeline, and no witness recalled hearing either a confrontation or a second voice in apartment 3B. Without camera footage, the investigative team could not eliminate the possibility entirely, but there was no supporting testimony or physical trace that linked any of them to the scene. Forensic evidence from the apartment offered no advancement. There were no fingerprints out of the ordinary, no unidentified clothing fibers, and no sign of forced struggle. The living space did not present broken objects, smeared stains, scratch marks, or displaced furniture. Nothing inside the unit suggested that any of the three named individuals had entered the apartment under duress, persuasion, or stealth. The absence of threatening letters, written confrontation, or evidence of recent arguments further reduced the likelihood that the incident originated from a heated, emotional conflict. Detectives approached timeline analysis as another elimination method. They reviewed work schedules, neighbor testimonies, and transportation records. Jackson had no documented alibi for the night, but there was also no evidence that he left or entered his unit after 10 p.m. Joey could not be placed geographically during crucial evening hours, but lacked any witness support placing him near Willow Street. Debbie was not scheduled to work with Michelle that weekend, and there was no trace of her participating in late-night meetings, phone calls, or unplanned visits. All three individuals had motive that could not be dismissed, yet none of them reached the threshold of actionable suspicion. At the conclusion of this segment of the investigation, detectives categorized each person as a potential but unconfirmed subject. The result was not a clearance, but a stalemate. Motives remained present, but opportunity lacked definition, and no forensic link created a compelling path forward. Each name stayed on record, but the investigation required a broader scope that went beyond interpersonal history or emotional context. With no confession, no verified location overlap, and no physical evidence emerging from the apartment, the case moved into a stage where investigators needed to look away from typical emotional triggers and instead reconsider patterns of access, familiarity with the building, and knowledge of resident routines. The search efforts for Michelle escalated quickly once officers concluded that her disappearance didn't follow the usual pattern of someone leaving voluntarily. By the end of the same week, search teams were dispatched around Willow Street and the surrounding neighborhood. The perimeter was set at approximately 3 miles, covering the apartment building, the outdoor parking area, the alley that ran behind the complex, a nearby maintenance shed, the drainage system, and a small wooded walking trail leading toward a community park. Officers wanted to find anything that could place Michelle outside the building or prove that she had been moved. They expected to find at least one trace, but there was nothing. Not a single item connected to her daily life, no purse, no clothing fibers, no personal belongings, and no sign of a struggle somewhere else. Multiple officers later described the early phase as searching for something that was never dropped. A volunteer firefighter assisting the team said, "We kept thinking maybe we missed a corner or a ditch, but there was simply nothing there to find." It was an unusual beginning for a missing person investigation, because most cases, even when they escalate, produce at least one physical lead within the first 72 hours. Inside the apartment, forensic work was conducted according to the investigative standards available to Portland police at the end of the 1980s. At that time, officers used visual inspection, fingerprint dusting powder, basic fiber collection tapes, and photography to document the scene. Advanced DNA testing, luminol blood detection sprays, and microtrace analysis were either unavailable or rarely used outside high-profile cases. Because there were no visible injuries, no signs of forced entry, and no documented struggle, the case did not qualify for special forensic resources. The apartment was treated as a suspicious missing person case, not a confirmed crime scene, which meant some investigative opportunities were never applied. Forensic officers reported no visible blood, no hair strands that could be confirmed as dislodged during force, no torn clothing, no damaged furniture, and no signs that any household item had been used as a weapon. The absence of evidence didn't prove safety. It only meant the event, whatever it was, didn't follow a loud or messy pattern. Nothing suggested that Michelle fought, shouted, or attempted to escape. That detail made the disappearance more unsettling, because it implied either compliance, surprise, or someone she did not view as a threat inside her physical space. Investigators proceeded to check the escape routes and secondary exit points within the building, the stairwell, the elevator, and the emergency exit door that connected to the alley. None of them showed scratches, dents, pry marks, or signs of abnormal use. The emergency door was intact, and the security bar hadn't been tampered with. That made it unlikely that Michelle was forced out in a rush or that someone panicked while trying to remove her. At the same time, outside search teams examined soil and pavement surfaces around the building for shoe imprints, drag marks, or tire tracks that appeared fresh. Because the weather had been dry for days and the building hallways were cleaned every morning, there was no physical imprint to follow. No mud trails, no dirt smudges on walls, no damaged landscaping, and no discarded items. It looked like the normal condition of a quiet apartment building where nothing unusual had taken place. The next step was to inspect vehicles. Officers examined the cars belonging to residents, frequent visitors, and those who were parked near the building during the time frame of the disappearance. License plates were recorded and cross-checked, but none were flagged or tied to an emergency report. No witness recalled seeing a car speeding out, double-parked, turning its lights off, or idling late at night. Every normal pattern in the environment stayed normal. That consistency was one of the most frustrating parts for detectives, because crimes that involve movement, whether voluntary or involuntary, usually leave an alteration somewhere.
At this stage, each of the 3 earlier suspects remained under review, and all provided partial alibis. None of them could be fully cleared, but none of them could be directly tied to evidence inside or outside the apartment. It placed investigators in a difficult zone. They had motive, proximity, and strained relationships, but nothing physical. The more officers dug, the more it appeared they were studying theory instead of following trails. One officer later summarized the obstacle. "We were standing in a room where something happened, but the room refused to admit it." That remark highlighted the central problem. The case lacked transitions. They knew where Michelle was at 5:40 p.m., and they knew she wasn't seen again after that. Everything in between was silent. To make progress, police needed objective, recorded movement. But in 1987, the Willow Street apartment building did not have interior hallway cameras or entrance surveillance systems. There were no motion sensors, no digital logs, and no video backups. Anyone with legal access, or the ability to tailgate behind a resident, could move inside the building without being documented. That technological gap erased both the entry path and the exit path, leaving detectives with only assumptions, not timestamps. Neighbors were asked once more if they heard anything unusual. Most said they didn't hear anything that night beyond regular apartment noise. A resident recalled hearing a television from Michelle's unit, which matched the previous timeline. Nobody mentioned yelling, banging, crashing, or footsteps at odd hours. That piece aligned with the observation that the bed was untouched and the coat remained in place, reinforcing the idea that whatever happened occurred early and quietly. With no evidence pointing outward, officers sealed the apartment under an official preservation order. It was not returned to rental circulation, and the unit remained locked as a potential forensic site for future review. Detectives hoped advancements in technology or new testimony might eventually turn the room into a source of answers, rather than a container of silence. After weeks of work, the official status of the file changed. The case was reclassified as cold, pending new information, new science, or a breakthrough that did not yet exist. The final wording in the investigative log emphasized the current reality. Every step taken so far had reached a stop sign, not a confirmation. On March 22nd, more than a week after Michelle vanished, her case finally moved from a quiet police file to the front page of the local paper. The article described her disappearance as under suspicious circumstances and summarized the few facts the public was allowed to know. A locked apartment, a TV left on, a missing woman with no history of running away. Within hours of the story circulating, the police tip line began to light up. Some calls were vague. Some were from people who simply wanted to talk. But a few stood out enough to be written down, replayed, and checked against the timeline. Among those calls was one from a resident on the second floor of Willow Street apartments. They said they remembered seeing Michelle in the hallway a few days before she disappeared. She wasn't alone. She was speaking briefly with the mailman. The caller could not recall the date precisely, nor the exact words, but they were sure of the pairing. Michelle, paper grocery bag at her side, and the uniformed postal worker standing close enough to talk. It was a small memory, easily forgotten in the blur of daily life. But now it suggested that someone other than neighbors and co-workers had interacted with her in the days leading up to March 14th. Detectives followed up on that detail by returning to the building manager. They asked about mail delivery, security arrangements, and who had permission to pass through the front entrance when the main door was locked. The manager confirmed that the regular mail carrier held a key to the lobby. That key allowed him to enter the building even when residents were out or doors were secured, a policy the management company considered practical for delivering parcels and registered letters outside typical hours if needed. This information changed how investigators saw the building's access structure. Up to that point, only residents, staff, and maintenance had been the focus. Now, there was someone else, with legitimate, routine access. Someone trusted enough to come and go without question.
The next stop for detectives was the local post office facility that covered Willow Street. Supervisors there confirmed that the mailman assigned to that route was a 54-year-old employee named Harvey Quinn. He had been working in that same area for more than 18 years. His record showed no violent offenses, no major disciplinary write-ups, and no complaints that resulted in formal punishment. To his co-workers, he was described as reliable, quiet, and consistent. He knew the streets by memory and could recite entire addresses without looking at a list. Back at Willow Street apartments, residents gave similar descriptions. Many said Harvey greeted them by name and occasionally made small talk about the weather or their families. One tenant told officers, "He was just the mailman. He'd ask how your day was, maybe mention your magazine being late, but that was it. You don't look at someone like that and think suspect." That perception, safe, familiar, unremarkable, was exactly what made investigators pause. A person who blends into the background can move through a building without drawing the kind of attention a stranger might. As police compiled information from each apartment, they noticed a pattern. Harvey was the only person who, aside from building staff, consistently accessed every mailbox in the complex. He had a reason to linger at the entrance, the lobby, the mail area, and occasionally the hallways. Over time, he could observe who was home during the day, who stayed out late, which doors rarely opened, and which residents lived alone. He would see overdue notices, appointment cards, bank mailers, and personal letters. Even without committing a crime, someone in his position could learn a great deal about the private routines of the people on his route. A few residents quietly mentioned that they had seen Harvey in the hallway more often than seemed necessary during the week before Michelle disappeared. He wasn't breaking rules, and no one complained at the time, but the pattern now felt different in hindsight. There were memories of him standing near the stairs, near the mailboxes after delivery time, or near the lobby door when people came and went. None of these sightings were dramatic on their own. Still, for detectives trying to understand who had both motive and opportunity, a person with recurring, unsupervised presence inside the building demanded closer scrutiny. When the investigation officially reached him, Harvey was called in for an interview. The tone at this stage was still exploratory, not accusatory. Detectives asked about his route, his schedule on the days around March 14th, and whether he recalled any unusual interaction with Michelle or anyone else at Willow Street. His answers were brief, controlled, and lacking in detail. He didn't offer much beyond what he was directly asked. At one point, he requested legal representation, effectively shortening the interview. One officer would later remark that he shut down fast, and that alone made us stop and re-examine his role in the case. After the interview, investigators cross-checked Harvey's statements against internal postal logs and recollections from residents. What they found did not fully align. His description of the exact times he delivered mail to Willow Street conflicted with the rough delivery windows kept by the post office. His claims about moving quickly through the building also clashed with a few resident accounts that placed him lingering in hallways or near the lobby longer than he suggested. There were no cameras to verify who was right, and no digital route trackers existed in 1987. The situation left them with a set of inconsistencies and no objective way to resolve them. Still, in an investigation with almost no movement, that inconsistency mattered. The file classification reflected that change. What had once been a cold, stagnating case with three loosely connected suspects, neighbor, ex-boyfriend, coworker, shifted into a new category, a potential insider access case. The emphasis was no longer just on personal conflict or emotional fallout. It was now on someone who had steady, normalized, and largely unquestioned access to the building and its residents, including a woman who lived alone in apartment 3B. Detectives drafted an expanded list of questions focused specifically on Harvey's presence. They wanted to know how often he returned to the building outside regular delivery, whether he had ever been called to handle missed packages after hours, and whether any resident had seen him inside when no mail was expected. They also looked into prior behavior, including any hint that he had tampered with or withheld personal correspondence. They were not prepared to label him responsible, but they were no longer comfortable labeling him harmless.
By the end of this phase, the case looked very different from the one that had started with a locked door and a running television. The investigation, once pulled in several directions by old disputes and past relationships, began to turn toward a single person who had quietly moved through Willow Street for years. He knew the doors, the routines, and the blind spots. For the first time, detectives had a lead that was not about who argued with Michelle, but about who had the practical power to reach her home without resistance and without raising alarm. The investigation entered a new phase once detectives realized they had been looking at the wrong angle. For weeks, the case had revolved around motives fueled by anger, jealousy, or emotional conflict, but none of those paths produced evidence strong enough to move the file forward. The notes in the case log gradually shifted tone, no longer asking who would want to hurt her, but instead, who could actually get to her without being noticed. The idea sounded simple, almost obvious, but it pushed the investigation into territory that had not been examined with real pressure before. Lawful access, routine presence, and unnoticed proximity. In late March, detectives rebuilt the timeline from scratch and removed any detail that could not be verified through physical evidence, official records, or aligned witness statements. When they took emotions and personal theories out of the equation, the remaining circle of possible access narrowed dramatically. They were no longer focused on who might have been angry, threatened, or rejected. They focused on who could enter the building and approach apartment 3B without raising suspicion, without damaging locks, without triggering attention, and without needing an invitation. The first procedural change was ordering delivery logs from the local postal service branch responsible for Willow Street apartments. Despite being handwritten and partly incomplete due to 1980s recording practices, they still offered more structure than verbal memory.
Once detectives cross-checked those entries with the time estimates provided by the postal depot's route supervisor, the numbers didn't align. According to official routing, delivery to Willow Street should have fallen between 4:55 p.m. and 5:25 p.m. on March 14th. Harvey, however, reported arriving closer to 6:30 p.m., claiming his schedule was delayed because of unexpected route congestion. No other postal employee in his sector reported similar delays that evening, and no correction notice was logged. Detectives expanded their interview approach to residents, shifting from emotional recollections to behavioral patterns. Instead of asking, "Did you hear anything strange that week?" they switched to, "Who did you see more or less than usual that week?" Residents responded with more detail when the question targeted routine instead of drama. The new method produced a small but meaningful thread. Multiple tenants recalled seeing Harvey inside or near the hallways at times that did not seem tied to regular mail delivery. Not suspicious at the time, but noticeable in hindsight. One resident from the second floor recalled a brief interaction. She said, "He asked me if I usually stayed late at work or if I was home most evenings. I didn't think much of it, but now it feels like he was trying to remember schedules." Detectives documented the statement and tagged it as behavioral relevance rather than direct evidence. They began to consider whether casual friendliness had been serving a different purpose, gathering information, not building community. When detectives obtained archived postal disciplinary records from 1981, they found that Harvey had received an internal written warning involving delayed personal mail suspected to have been opened for non-malicious curiosity. At the time, the incident was dismissed as poor judgment rather than malicious intent, and no further action was taken. But in the context of a missing resident case, the disciplinary note no longer looked harmless. It fit a pattern of personal boundaries being tested quietly, without confrontation, without physical force, and without leaving visible damage. A new investigative request revealed a 45-minute undocumented gap in Harvey's March 14th delivery route, with no postal justification. There had been no weather disruptions, no traffic reports affecting his sector, no emergency protocol triggered, and no delivery returns logged. The gap sat directly inside the time frame that overlapped with Michelle's last verified signs of life inside apartment 3B. The significance of a 45-minute window in a building with limited visibility and no surveillance cameras changed the case trajectory. Investigators noted it as the first timeline inconsistency in the file that had no logical explanation.
With enough circumstantial justification, detectives obtained a secondary search warrant targeted at objects, notes, or personal items that could indicate an interest-based fixation rather than violent evidence. When officers entered Harvey's residence, they didn't find weapons, blood, clothing fibers, or signs of physical struggle. Instead, they found small, non-valuable personal items that belonged to several different Willow Street residents. Keychains, receipts, handwritten notes, calendar slips, and one stamped envelope that had never been delivered. None of the objects had monetary value. None triggered immediate criminal classification. But they signaled behavioral intrusion disguised as harmless curiosity. Investigators began drafting what they labeled as a crime pattern theory. A woman living alone, with a predictable work schedule, minimal social involvement, limited daily interaction, and a routine that rarely changed. Michelle fit each of those points. Combined with a building without hallway cameras, a mailman with pass-key access, and a tenant community accustomed to his presence, detectives began shaping the term insider exploitation and familiarity-based targeting. It was not a crime of passion, nor a spontaneous confrontation. The working theory was that someone may have observed, tested boundaries, and gathered information long before the night she vanished. When the case board was updated, detectives moved Harvey from a peripheral subject to the primary person of interest. The three original suspects, Jackson Reeve, Joseph Marvin, and Debbie Nolan, were not fully dismissed, but were placed under secondary observation rather than active pursuit. Their motives still existed on paper, but access and proximity were now considered the stronger investigative currency. The progression of these findings changed the tone of the entire investigation. What had started as an emotional motive search was now viewed through the lens of controlled proximity, trusted access, and familiarity that looked safe on the outside. The disappearance was no longer classified as random, impulsive, or emotionally fueled. Investigators now believed it may have involved planning, quiet confidence, and the actions of someone who could move inside the building without setting off alarms. Someone the community knew by name. The case did not close or break open after this phase, but something critical had changed. For the first time, detectives believed they were no longer looking outward, but inward. The investigation entered a new stage when detectives gathered again to review every interview transcript, every timeline note, and every piece of physical observation. The emotional-based theories that once seemed reasonable were no longer strong enough to carry the case forward. There was no evidence of jealousy, no documented confrontation, and no confirmed argument. The team shifted the direction from "why would someone feel something strong enough to do this?" to "who could do this without creating any sign of struggle, panic, or visible disruption. The case was now built on access, familiarity, information, timing, and the ability to walk through a locked building unnoticed. With that shift, the three original suspects, Jackson, Joey, and Debbie, were moved into a secondary review category. They were not cleared, but they were no longer the primary focus, because nothing connected them to a moment of opportunity. Their motives existed, but the pathway to the apartment did not. Their stories still remained in the file for follow-up and cross-reference, but detectives documented them under insufficient direct evidence. The urgency to understand how someone could enter and exit apartment 3B smoothly, without leaving a trace, outweighed every emotional motive that had previously looked strong. Attention moved toward the one individual who had not simply been near the building, but inside it, repeatedly, and without resistance. The file was updated to list Harvey Quinn as the primary investigative focus. It wasn't based on a confession, nor on a single alarming incident, but on a collection of circumstances that fit together in a way no other profile did. Harvey had long-term access, a natural reason to be near every apartment unit, and enough routine presence to avoid suspicion. He also carried personal familiarity that went far beyond casual service interaction. Investigators wrote in the case log that he appeared to know people's work hours, social habits, and personal schedules. In addition, He was the only person whose timeline contained a sizable gap the night Michelle was last verified inside her home. Detectives met privately and agreed on a new behavioral hypothesis. The working theory was not a sudden emotional explosion or a crime triggered by argument, but a calculated act, potentially driven by fixation, curiosity, or targeted interest that grew with time. They noted that individuals who operate through observation tend to plan quietly, study patterns, and wait for a specific gap in routine. One investigator summarized it in a meeting. "This doesn't feel like rage. It feels like someone who figured out when nobody would interrupt." A full timeline reconstruction was created across 3 layers: the access timeline, the movement timeline inside and around the building, and the private window timeline covering hours when Michelle was likely alone, relaxed, and not expecting contact. For the first time, investigators were not looking for emotional triggers. They were looking for logistical alignment. The more the timelines were compared, the clearer the alignment became, and Harvey's name was present in every column of opportunity. A supplemental forensic proposal was drafted and sent for approval. Instead of searching only for physical force, the proposal asked to re-examine minor trace elements, small items, inconsistent placements, mail interactions, and anything related to personal privacy breaches. The request emphasized that not all crimes require visible violence, especially when the perpetrator has knowledge of how to avoid detection. The case was then transferred to a behavioral analysis and privacy-related crime division to evaluate social positioning, pattern familiarity, pre-event behaviors, and control tendencies. Analysts requested interviews or written statements from residents regarding small moments that felt unusual but harmless at the time. This included friendly questions, unexpected presence in hallways, uninvited advice, or comments about routine. One resident explained, "He always seemed nice, but he remembered things I didn't even remember telling him." This statement was documented as an example of unnoticed boundary crossing. Detectives built a new list of targeted questions for the second interrogation round. These questions focused on why Harvey was present in areas outside his assigned route, how he knew the approximate schedules of multiple residents, and why his activity logs did not align with his route sheet. Rather than confronting him with accusations, investigators prepared questions that tested consistency across time, not emotion. They needed to know if his answers about March 14th matched his behavior patterns from the weeks before. An expanded witness map was created with 4 categories: frequent interactions, rare interactions, incidental overlaps, and indirect auditory exposure. Detectives sought to identify anyone who might recall something that no longer seemed important. They prioritized short conversations, service exchanges, and hallway comments that, when viewed out of context, might indicate tracking rather than friendliness. A team member wrote, "We are no longer focused on what people heard. We are focused on what they didn't think mattered." To finalize the section, detectives drafted an internal report summarizing the suspect profile that aligned most closely with the working evidence. The most cited sentence in that report read, "The suspect profile fits someone normalized, trusted, and overlooked, not feared. It was the first time the case file acknowledged that harm could come from someone who blended seamlessly into the background. Someone who did not need to force entry, because they lived inside the routine. With that report submitted, the case status remained active, but the arc of suspicion now centered on one person. The team documented the closure for this stage as active review, pending evidence. It was not a formal conclusion, not a solved case, and not yet a direct accusation. But after days of confusion, it marked a defined direction. The disappearance of Michelle Baylor was no longer treated as unexplained. It was now treated as deliberate, calculated, and carried out by someone with knowledge, patience, and invisible access. And that shift changed everything. If you found this breakdown gripping and want the next chapter, please like, subscribe, and comment your theory below. Do you think this case points to planning, obsession, or something else entirely? Your engagement helps keep real case storytelling alive.